Go away. Guys, come with me. It's a very exciting time. Let me just open the door. One day they're coming in. Let me just... Get off the lawn! Let me in, paparazzi. Right. Well, hello everyone. Well, I've got to say apologies. There's loads of press and paparazzi waiting for me, but obviously my subscribers are of the utmost importance. So I've just dedicated this time to you guys. It's all getting very hectic at the moment. I'm not sure. I think I might have just appeared in Hello magazine. It's really getting serious, okay? Oh, bloody camera. Let's keep that there. Right. Yesterday, 25th of March 2017, probably the biggest day in my YouTube career, okay? Just try and take that in, right? I woke up in the morning, 293 subscribers. I wake up now, 26th of March 2017, and, well, I just can't believe it. I think someone's going to have to pinch me in a second, but I'm on 300 subscribers. Okay, and I'm not sure that I was really prepared now after doing all these videos. 8 years I've been doing this. It suddenly hit me now that maybe I can't take all this fame. It's really put me on the spot, you know. I'm really feeling it. I've never had so much exposure before. So I think I'm just going to do this video just to get it over with. And announce who is the 300 subscriber. There's been a lot of verifications and things like that. So I can tell you some people. Firstly, I want to say thank you to all who subscribed. Okojokwu Okem. It's not you. Sorry. Nadine Mohammed Magdi. Thank you. But it's not you. Teabag of God. As much as I wish it was you. It's not you. So, without further ado, my 300 subscriber is... Emily Martin. Now, first of all, many congratulations to you, you deserve it, and obviously you'll have a video dedicated to you in due course. But just to give people a bit of a taster, here are some... an insight into the world of my 300 subscriber, Emily Martin. Hello, it's the 7th video in the Evolutionary Ecology series. Now today, we're going to do something a little bit different, okay? For the past 6 videos, we've been talking about adaptation, haven't we? And how evolution is always adaptive, yeah? It always generates perfect solutions. But now, well, for the next few videos, we're going to look at some of the limits to adaptation. Because actually, that statement which I just said is completely incorrect. Evolution doesn't necessarily generate perfect solutions. Which sort of contradicts loads of ideas that were once thought by philosophers and whatnot for thousands of years, when they thought that all these complex interactions and the similarities between organisms were workings of a creator's mind. This led to the field of natural theology, which was particularly popular in 19th century Britain. And basically the heart of this idea was that all organisms are perfect and the study of wildlife was almost godly. Alright? But the best evidence we have of life on this planet not being the workings of a creator's mind is by showing that actually organisms aren't perfectly adapted. And the best example of that, I think, probably, is the vertebrate eye. Now, you've probably learned a lot about the vertebrate eye before, but here's a picture of the vertebrate eye, and see if we can identify some of its flaws. Now, I talked a little bit about this in the sensory ecology series, but of course, not everyone saw that incredible blockbuster, so let's have a go. So the first thing to take into account is that the photoreceptors in the eye are actually facing in completely the wrong direction, okay? The nerve fibres actually are in front of them, which means that they have to escape the retina via the optic nerve, okay? Now, because that optic nerve needs to be there, that means there's a space in the eye where there are no photoreceptors. And that place is called the blind spot. Okay, so that's pretty weird. Imagine if some technology person, I don't know what they're called, invented a camera with all the light receptors facing in the wrong way. You'd get sacked immediately. Also, the blood vessels which supply the light sensitive part of the eye with oxygen and nutrients also interfere with our visual perception. And to resolve all this, obviously we don't just see a black dot in our vision, so to resolve this, the eye has to constantly be vibrating slightly to resolve all these problems. Okay, but of course that takes energy. Yeah, and actually, when you look at organisms such as squid, they don't have these problems, right? So any ideas saying that we are the most perfectly designed organism on the planet, absolute bollocks. And the bad design of the eye is a legacy of its evolutionary history. If you think back to when the eye first evolved, it started off as just a membrane of cells which became light sensitive, and slowly over time these light sensitive cells invaginated into the epidermis. Once these filled with fluid to create lenses and so on, and they became more pigmented and stuff to get to where we are today, they carried little mistakes along with them. Now, we've got to the point now where we can't actually go back and change those mistakes. So it's like saying you can't redesign the plane when it's already in the air, right? It's always worth remembering is what was good or adaptive back then when the eye was in its early stages of evolution isn't necessarily a good thing now. So at the time it was selected for, but now we see it as an evolutionary byproduct, which isn't particularly useful. Another great example is when you compare mice and giraffes. Clearly, very different animals, especially in terms of their neck. But do you know what? The amount of cervical vertebrae in the necks of mice and giraffes is exactly the same. They both have 7, okay? Well, that seems incredibly strange. So instead, the cervical vertebrae on a giraffe are obviously much longer. This makes a giraffe's neck very fragile and requires a lot of energy to keep it stiff. Okay, so why don't they have more then? Well, it's thought that the genes involved in determining the number of cervical vertebrae are turned on pretty early in the development of these animals. Therefore, any mutations in these particular genes will have further consequences later on, which could be lethal. Okay, so instead, mutations have occurred in genes which extend the period of the vertebrae growth rather than the number of vertebrae. But clearly a sign of bad adaptation. Another one is seen when you compare Antarctic and tropical bird metabolisms. They're exactly the same, but clearly the tropics and the Antarctic are two very different places. So somehow these Antarctic birds have to maintain the same body temperature as these birds found in the tropics. So for that they've got to spend lots of energy eating food, they've got to have thick feathers to keep them warm, some even huddle together with other individuals to keep them warm. That requires a lot of energy. Okay, so it makes you wonder, why can't the body temperature of Antarctic birds be lower? Okay? This is likely to be because the Krebs cycle has proteins that are so sensitive to temperature that this is pretty much impossible. Okay, it's another example of maladaptation. Another one closer to home is your bollocks. Right, so our testes hang outside our bodies so they're ventilated, right, to prevent them overheating. So that means they can produce the optimum amount of spermatozoa. Very lovely. But that makes them extremely vulnerable, as anyone who's been kicked in the bollocks with a football knows, right? So why can't the temperature of spermatogenesis be higher. Yeah, so we can keep our bollocks inside our body and not have them so exposed. Okay? Well, it's the same question that we were talking about with the birds. It's these genes that have been carried on through evolution that we've got to a point now, if we were to mutate one of those genes, then that'll have lethal consequences elsewhere because they affect other pathways. Okay? Loads of other examples in humans, of course. Eating can be a pretty treacherous experience as well, because the trachea is right next to the esophagus. So that means it's pretty easy to choke, as this inspiring film shows. Because we evolved from filter feeders, and these filter feeders receive their oxygen and their food at the same time through the same organs. Okay, so we're stuck with it. There are loads of other aspects, of course. Bipedalism can also have many negatives to it, as this video clearly shows.
Benito! Oh gosh! Oh, blimey! Blimey heck!
And then, of course, childbirth can be extremely dangerous, as shown by my lovely friend Amy.
Benito, don't even think about it.
Oh, fine. Okay. So basically, man is a mechanical misfit. All these maladaptations are signs of our evolutionary legacy. Oh, what has happened? God, weird lighting today, I must admit. God, it's almost as if it's a completely different day. Anyway. So basically what we conclude from all these examples then that we've talked about is that, well, evolution isn't necessarily blind, but it's short-sighted, right? It requires these intermediate transitional forms for any fit adaptation to evolve. And it's these intermediates which allow us to see that all organisms on this planet are related. There are therefore limits to the type of mutational variation that's possible, as the effect mutations have on fitness is determined by genome evolution, which happened in the past, because we brought all these constraints along with us during our evolution. So we then must ask, well, what proportion of these mutations which are occurring constantly in the genome are important in evolution? Maybe it's only some, okay? Because some, as we saw with, for example, the giraffe's neck, if mutations occur in certain genes, then they're likely to be lethal. And this is all connected to the study of evo-devo, which is how genotypes create phenotypes during development. Okay? And it all relies on this idea that we've talked about before, and that's pleiotropy. Okay? Because pleiotropy is where one gene can have multiple effects. So even if a mutation arises which will benefit one aspect of an organism, it may very well be lethal in another aspect. Okay? So that means that these fit genotypes have more difficulty evolving. Okay? And we know that pleiotropy exists because the rate of mutations is less than the effect mutations have on those traits. So that suggests that there are genes which have multiple effects, pleiotropic effects. This which reduces this modularity. Another important concept is epistasis. Epistasis is interactions between alleles at different loci. So it could just be that two genes which are located on different places on different chromosomes, when they come together, they create an adaptive trait, right? But that may explain a lot of the variation we see, because these benefit effects are only transient, because in a sexually reproducing organism, in the next generation, it's quite likely that those genes will be broken apart again. This suggests only maybe a small proportion of mutations are important in adaptation, okay? Because it's very difficult for that adaptation to evolve if those genes, which are so important, are constantly being torn apart from one another. Okay, so there's less of an evolutionary pressure. So that makes us wonder, well, is this genetic evolution predictable? And we've sort of considered this before, and we've also considered the types of mutations which may be important. I've worded them slightly differently here. So basically, there's cis-regulatory and structural mutations. So the cis-regulatory genes are those regulatory genes that regulate the expression of other genes, and the structural mutations is what actually produces a protein product. Now this has created a divide in this field of evolutionary biologists, because some people think that cis-regulatory genes are more important, whilst others think structural mutations are more important. Particularly the two main leaders of all of this is Carroll and Hoekstra. Carroll believes cis-regulatory genes are the key to phenotypic evolution during development, whilst Hoekstra believes structural mutations are more important. And there's counter-arguments for and against each of these, but really when you look through all this evidence, I mean, it doesn't have to be two separate things. These two types of genes are likely to be working together. Sean Carroll thinks that there isn't enough protein divergence to explain all these phenotypic variations that we see. And there's also suggestions that these signalling pathway genes don't evolve fast enough at the protein level to influence development. Whereas these cis-regulatory genes allows novel functions to be generated. Okay? Whereas the structural proteins are likely to have very strong negative pleiotropic effects. As we've talked about, when there's pleiotropy, that provides a significant constraint for adaptation. However, Hoekstra and Coyne think, oh no, there's loads of evidence for structural changes evolving quickly. Great example being gene duplications. When genes duplicate, then that's a very good way of removing all these pleiotropic effects, because once these genes duplicate, then they become separated from each other. So that means they can essentially evolve separately from each other now. So maybe they'll specialise so they only affect one trait, for example. That's an extreme idea. And we've seen this is definitely the case. In some organisms, whole genome duplications are really important. We talked about how that's really important in plant speciation in an earlier video. So evidence from gene duplications comes from clusters of genes which are together or near each other on a chromosome, which all serve similar sort of functions. Example are globins and the MHC. Another great example is the Hox gene complex in animals. And this has passed relatively unchanged in some animals and affects big changes in body plan. So it's really, really important. That's where I'm going to leave it today. We're going to carry on looking more specifically on whether genetic evolution is predictable next time. So I'll see you then.